Well, this agreement is the result of a compromise idea that was only first floated a couple days ago, which basically exempts Russian oil imports via pipeline. So this ban on Russian oil imports only applies to Russian oil imports coming by sea. Now, this has been negotiated for many, many weeks. This proposal came almost a month ago, and Hungary was threatening a veto on this, saying that the impact on Hungary's economy would be too great because they get all of their Russian oil by pipeline. And so this compromise effectively, it was able to get over that threat of a Hungarian veto because Hungary won't be affected by this at all, because they can still continue importing Russian oil by pipeline. Now, the ban on the Russian oil that comes via sea, that is 2/3 of the Russian oil that is imported into the EU. But late last night, after this agreement was reached, Commission President Ursula von der Leyen was saying that this will end 90% of Russian oil imports to the EU by the end of the year. Why the discrepancy? Well, that's because Poland and Germany gave verbal assurances last night that they will not use this exemption, that they will end all of their Russian oil imports by the end of the year, even the imports coming via pipeline, which for them is most of the imports. There is a Russian oil pipeline called the Druzhba pipeline, which is split into northern and southern branches. The northern branch goes to Germany and Poland, and von der Leyen said last night that imports from that pipeline will end by the end of this year. Then there's the southern branch, which goes to Hungary, Czechia, and Slovakia. Those imports will continue, and that represents 10% of Russian oil imports to the EU. Now, there are still some big concerns about this ideal. It's really relying on a lot of trust. We're trusting that Germany and Poland will stick by their verbal agreement to not use this exemption, which they legally could. We're trusting that eventually Czechia, Slovakia, and Hungary will end their oil imports. That is the spirit of this compromise. And then, of course, we're trusting that Hungary will not allow the oil that they're receiving by pipeline to continue on to the rest of the EU single market. This was the big concern from other countries, that this will distort the level playing field in the single market, because that Russian oil coming via pipeline will now be much, much cheaper than the other oil coming via sea. And the concern is that that Russian oil, because it's so much cheaper, could spread to the rest of the EU single market just through market forces. So they have to trust that Hungary is going to be able to not allow that to happen. A lot of trust in this deal. This is just a political agreement. The legalities of this have to be agreed in a legal text that will be coming in the next day. And that legal text is going to be very, very tricky, because the energy market is very complicated, and every detail in that text is going to make a big difference.
Dave, listening to that then, I mean, isn't this a huge victory for Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orban?
It sure is. I mean, if you look at what he was originally demanding, he got everything he wanted and more. The original proposal already made a gesture to him by saying that Hungary and Slovakia would have an extra year to phase out Russian oil by the end of 2023. He wouldn't accept that. This compromise actually allows Hungary to continue importing Russian oil in perpetuity. There is no time limit to this. And in addition, in the negotiations last night with other leaders, Orban was able to secure an additional exemption, which would allow Hungary to import Russian oil by sea if anything happens to the pipeline that passes under Ukraine, bringing them Russian oil. This came, of course, after last week's perceived threat from a Ukrainian government official where they said something might happen to that pipeline. The Hungarian government was furious about that, and they were Orban was demanding this exemption, saying they can't trust that Ukraine wouldn't do something to the pipeline. He got that exemption. So I think Viktor Orban can certainly return to the Hungarian people and say, look, we are completely unaffected by this ban, and in addition, if Ukraine tries to do anything to our source of Russian oil, we now have an exemption that we could get it by sea. Of course, Hungary doesn't have any ports, but they could secure a contract with another port in another country to bring the Russian oil over. This will really amplify those voices that say this veto that national governments have in the areas of foreign policy and EU lawmaking needs to end, that they need to go to a qualified majority system of voting like exists in all the other areas of EU policymaking, because this allows one single leader to hold the entire EU to hostage and win.
Dave, thanks very much. Dave Keating, our correspondent, talking to us live there from Brussels.